Okay, welcome everyone to the presentation here. My name is Kevin Mosher. You're going to see a great picture of me in a second. I'm a certified labor and employment specialist, HR attorney, partner up here at Thompson Co. out of the Minnesota office, and I'm really excited. I took a month off. You know, normally I do these webinars pretty religiously, but took a month off, and I had one of my couple of my partners do last month's presentation, which is really nice, and it sounds like it was a great presentation on dealing with transgender issues in the workplace, that sort of thing. And if anybody, I will say this before we even jump into this, if anybody's unfamiliar with our website, it's there's thompsonco.com, but there's also the myHRgenius.co website where we put all of these webinars so you can watch them at your leisure, including the last one, which sounds like it was really great. This month we are going to talk about drug testing and medical marijuana. We're going to really focus on a lot of conversation around drug testing, around why we want to do it, what we want to look at, because there's nothing at the national level other than with like DOT drivers, over-the-road drivers, that we have to look at. So we need to understand states, and we need to understand consistent practices for companies that are across multiple states and how to address it and all of that. So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. I'm really excited about it. And for those of you who are new to the podcast, by the way, we're doing podcasts. That's not this. This is a webinar. So for those of you who are new to the webinar series, this is me, super smiley in this picture, and happy to present to you. If you have any questions, you're welcome to write them in the, I think there's like a Q&A type of chat. As time allows, I will try to take a look at those. I find that when I stop and try to read them, I can read kind of fast, but when I stop and try to read them, that it's just like a strange pause, and it doesn't flow. And I know everybody loves to hear my melodiously speedy speech voice here, and without any pauses or breath. So I'll see if I can get to it. But if I can't get to your question, and if I didn't cover it, I will follow up with you with either a call or an email on your question. So I definitely do invite questions, and I'm happy to respond to them. So really excited about today's presentation. For those of you who are new or aren't familiar with our myHRgenius program that Thompson Co. provides, it is a subscription-based HR legal service. And entry level is $79. It doesn't matter the size of your company. It is $79 for call us as much as you want, or email us with your labor and employment HR questions. And there's obviously enhanced programs for more legal services at a subscription rate. And the Genius being the really great value. If you have handbooks that you need to get done, Brainiac is really awesome because it includes model legal documents that we've created. So it's a really phenomenal program. If you're interested in registering, you can find us you can call any of our attorneys, our labor and employment attorneys at Thompson Co., or go to the myHRgenius.co website to register or find more information. Okay, these are the services you get. We're doing podcasts now, by the way. If those of you who are new to the webinar, you're probably also new to the podcast, and you can get the podcast on Apple, Google, Stitcher, Spotify, I think, and also on the myHRgenius.co website. Got 6 or 7 of them up, and I had a really great one with a longtime HR consultant who's got a lot of breadth of doing this for like 35 plus years, and some really good pointer tips on interviewing that I think anybody doing HR would be really it'd be really valuable to listen to. It was valuable for me, and I do this as well on a daily basis, talking to companies all day about HR issues. Okay, so topics to cover. We're going to talk about cannabis, drug testing, and employee protections under these drug testing laws. One of the reasons we try to pre-register everybody is so that I can get some information about where you are. So all of you should have received today some marijuana from Thompson Co. and drug testing kit. So we're going to try to just do some like interaction since we're not doing this as a seminar. So if you can get your marijuana, I'm totally kidding, obviously, but it'd be really cool. Like if we had a seminar, you could probably do this in California, right, where it's legal, where you just start passing around marijuana. I'm sure some people have probably thought about doing that. I think there's is it the Joe Rogan show where he was like smoking? Maybe he does this frequently, but at least like I think it's a podcast or a show that he does, and he was like literally smoking marijuana during like a 2 or 3 hour interview with like a CEO of a company. So and that wasn't even like the big part of the news about his podcast. Anyway, we're not going to do that today. I helped write the handbook over at Thompson Co. And smoking marijuana during a webinar is just not one of the things. It's also illegal in Minnesota, as it is in most states. But anyway, so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about drug testing, and so we're gonna introduction to cannabis. And I think one of the if we look at nationally, and I'll show you a chart here, showing, I think there are 11 states. Illinois is the most recent to join the list, but there are like 11 states or so that have legalized recreational marijuana. So when we talk about it, we talk about recreational marijuana. That's a much more limited scope. Colorado being the first state to do it, and of course, when Colorado went to recreational marijuana several years ago, it coined a lot of Rocky Mountain High phrases out there, probably a lot of memes on the internet, but it also created I think billions of dollars in weed tourism. And so, you would have business and just, forget about recreational tourist type stuff. Just think about it from a business perspective. You're sending employees to Colorado who might be grabbing some marijuana or cookies or brownies or whatever they're getting over in Colorado, and maybe taking that while they're on a work trip or at a conference. This is not unheard of. These issues happen. And how do you deal with it when somebody is, out on a trip in a state that it's legalized? Well, it used to be just Colorado, and of course all the conventions wanted to go to Colorado so their employees could get high legally. But now we've got California out there and Illinois. It's coming online with this in 2020. So recreational marijuana, obviously, it's the direction that the country is going. It also does not seem to be a political issue. Everything seems to be a political issue. Marijuana does not seem to be a political issue, and you'll see it with the states that have legalized it. It is red, blue, purple, there does not seem to be any sort of political commonality among the states that are legalizing and not legalizing recreational. Well, we've got recreational, right? I think everybody understands recreational. Then we've got medical cannabis. Obviously, very different than just smoking marijuana recreationally or taking a bunch of brownies. Medical cannabis is specifically given to people as part of a medical regimen. Now, all the states are, so there's no federal law on this, right? It's just the federal law prohibits this, and marijuana, cannabis is. There are medical terms for this. I'm not going to bother because I would butcher it, but like cannabinoids or whatever, there it is. You've heard me butcher it now. At the federal level, those are still controlled substances. So we have to look at, and so you don't want to take those controlled substances like over borders because then that would be potentially a federal crime. But within the states, that's where the states have jumped in and they've started to regulate this. Now, medical cannabis is where it started. Right, so and it mainly started not with your token potheads up there getting in front of the legislatures of all these states. And by the way, most states now have some sort of they have some sort of program that allows for medical cannabis, and it's not being driven by potheads. It's being driven by parents and kids who have long-term lasting medical conditions that give them a lot of pain. And so, for example, up in Minnesota, and Minnesota is just one example, but this happened pretty much in every state with coordinated lobbying efforts. These parents of kids with pain, with medical conditions that were giving them a lot of pain, whether it's cancer or MS or whatever it is, they were going and they're just sitting in those committees at the legislature, and they're just, doe eyes, crying, tears. Who wants to tell kids that they because I've got this ideological belief that marijuana is bad? Why would a legislator ever want to say that that kids can't get medical cannabis if it could be something that would help alleviate their pain and symptoms? And so that's where medical cannabis came, and that really wasn't that long ago. I mean, it's really within the last 5 or so years that medical cannabis has come along the lines. Now, that has then transformed on the medical side into the CBD oil, which is popping up like crazy. It's the new elixir, right? It's the new snake oil. I'm not saying I'm skeptical. I am skeptical, but I'm not saying that I don't know anything really about it other than what I've heard from people. But people are now saying, hey, it's great. The CBD oil is now. So you've got, I put it on, I put it under my tongue, I take it, it helps me with pain, with anxiety, with all of these things, but it doesn't have THC. THC being the part that gives you the high with marijuana. So we really have, when we look at this whole issue, we have on one side, we have recreational marijuana. We're going to call them the potheads, right? So we've got the recreational marijuana, and then we've got the medical cannabis, and we've got the CBD oil. And some states, like I believe Texas just recently, Texas has a CBD oil program, right? But some states have a medical cannabis program, and how those states are defining what medical conditions can be covered under this program is different from state to state. So in Minnesota, for example, when they first passed this, it was very, very limited. They were very, very skeptical of medical cannabis, very skeptical. And so the way they defined who could be part of this program was very limited to just people that had long-time huge symptoms. For the most part, it was people that were in so much pain that they would never be able to enter the workforce. So it really wasn't that much of an issue with regard to drug testing in Minnesota. But then they've since loosened it, and most states are loosening it. Now, some states they're starting to try with CBD oil, and then they might look at medical cannabis as well. And then who knows, in the future they might go to recreational in a few years. But we have to understand each state to understand how this is potentially going to impact the recruiting pool that we have, and whether we want to, if we don't have a drug testing program right now, whether we should have a drug testing program. Okay, there it is, recreational marijuana. One of the interesting things that I find with recreational marijuana is, and there's probably, books about marijuana and songs and stuff like that. I don't know. There's probably stuff like that. But the interesting thing that I find is that in states that have legalized recreational marijuana, the increase is, so 13% of U.S. adults say they currently smoke marijuana. Okay, so I don't know what that means, if it's daily or weekly or what. But what's interesting is that there is a percentage of about 10% of the people that if it were legal, they would do it. And so, we'll see what happens in Illinois. But based on studies in California and Colorado, those states that have passed recreational marijuana laws, they have the population. There's a part of the population, a pretty significant part of the population, that's on the sidelines and is ready to jump in once it's legal. I guess. I didn't know there were people out there that were caring that much about the recreational marijuana laws, but there it is. So here are the states that have legalized that have done some sort of legalization. The two states, Illinois and Maine, I put Maine twice because it's so important, right? Illinois and Maine have have passed laws that have the most interesting aspects to how they impact the drug testing. So with regard to those two states, we need to understand, now we're going to talk about drug testing and why you should drug test and whether to drug test and what your drug testing program should look like and all that. But we need to understand that although none of these states have prohibited employers from drug testing, it is interesting that in Illinois and Maine, they have put some criteria around that restrict, and they basically say you can't discriminate and retaliate against employees on the basis because of their, almost like it's a protected class, testing for recreational testing for marijuana. Now, we've got already in many states where cannabis is, where there's a medical cannabis program, most states where there's a medical cannabis program, there is something in that program that says, hey, you employer, if you have a drug testing program, you cannot take into consideration the testing for THC or for cannabinoids or whatever it is. And I'm so sorry that I'm not a doctor. I'm a lawyer, not a doctor. So so you can't discriminate or hold that against employees in most, if not all, the states that have medical cannabis rules. Minnesota is an example, and Oklahoma is an example, and all that. So that's how it works with cannabis. But Illinois and Maine seem to be going a step further in restricting employers from the types of consideration and testing that they can do, which is interesting because like Illinois hasn't had a drug testing statute on the books, but now that they're legalizing marijuana, they're saying that employers that do have these sorts of drug testing are going to have to limit the circumstances and the things that they can consider for drug testing. So like I say, if you take a look at the list of states that have legalized, it is it is across the political spectrum. Okay, so drug testing, we're going to start from kind of like top to bottom, all the stuff about drug testing and how I think about it and considerations and all that. But that's just the general framework. Now, the reason we want, the reason that we're doing the webinar today is because, well, first of all, these recreational marijuana laws and certainly the medical cannabis laws and CBD oil, it's everywhere. I mean, it has really exploded. This was not on the radar 10 years ago. I know there was a lot of lobbying for it 10 years ago and has been forever about recreational marijuana, but really once the lobbying effort happened with the kids going around and talking about how difficult it is living with the pain, that's when the floodgates really started to open up on medical cannabis and CBD oil. And now just within 2 or 3 blocks of my office, there have been 3 CBD oil vendors opened up in just the last couple months. I mean, it's everywhere. You see it in, I think I saw it in an airport. I think I saw it in an airport recently. Anyway, I just feel like I'm seeing CBD oil everywhere. It's going to, and again, it's going to cure all the pains. But how does that impact, right? We are in, at least today, we'll see next year, we will definitely have a webinar on group and mass terminations next year, because I think that's coming down the pipeline for a lot of employers. But we're right now in a tight recruiting market for most positions, certainly professional positions, but really I think it's just a really low unemployment rate, and most employers are having a hard time finding people. Well, how is that impacting? If we've got a narrow pool of applicants and then we mix that in with marijuana, which is legal in some states, well, how does that mix? And so we're going to talk about that. And every company is probably going to have a different take on it. But then the other thing, and just as a baseline, because I get this question a lot, which is, well, what do I do? My state just legalized. Let's just say it's Illinois. My state's legalizing marijuana. Like, do I need to get rid of my drug testing program? And the answer is, well, no. I mean, we might have to look at it and tweak it. And if you don't have a written program, you need to have a written program if you're drug testing. That's, everywhere in the country. You really, best practice, you need to have a drug testing program. But the answer is, look, alcohol is legal. I think everywhere. Maybe there might be some dry counties or whatever, but let's just say in every state you can get some alcohol. Super legal doesn't mean that, and if marijuana is legal, how is that any different? It doesn't mean that just because it's legal that, you might have some dumb employee coming in with a joint or whatever of marijuana. Well, you wouldn't. If you have a drug-free workplace policy, which every employer should have in their handbook, if you don't, please put a drug-free workplace policy. It's different than a testing policy. Drug-free workplace policy is driven by federal law. You want to put that in your handbook. But alcohol is legal. If marijuana is legal, that doesn't mean you own your property. That doesn't mean you have to allow them to bring the marijuana on. Even with cannabis, with the medical cannabis programs. Most every state that I'm familiar with, there might be an outlier out there that I might have missed, and there's a lot of states, but every state that I'm familiar with still prohibits you from bringing that medical cannabis into the workplace. It still says there's still parts in that statute which say that, hey, yeah, you can't. We're gonna exempt a drug test. We're going to exempt a positive for cannabinoid, or I'm terrible at that word, but anyway, that word, bad stuff, controlled substance, that you find in the cannabis. But that doesn't mean that we're going to force employers in your state to allow you to bring in your cannabis. So employers in those states, even where there are medical cannabis, where medical cannabis is super legal, and it's going to exempt you on drug testing for that, you still, one, can prohibit them from bringing it in to the workplace. Two, prohibit them from taking it. So, which kind of, if they can't bring it in the workplace, it's impossible to take it, right? We can't email medical cannabis into somebody's system, I don't think. And then three, most states, if not all the states that I'm familiar with, say even so, even if you can take it and we're going to forgive you for having it in your system, you still cannot be, quote, impaired. Now, what is impaired? Good luck figuring it out. It's so new. Most states don't have a great definition of what impaired is, but you still can't be impaired. And so there are, even with medical cannabis, there are still restrictions. And certainly in a recreational marijuana state, you can, those restrictions, you don't have to allow them to bring it onto your property. You definitely don't have to allow them to be impaired. So even if they test positive, and then pretty much every state, and we have to look at Illinois and Maine a little bit closer, but pretty much every state says that, well, if they test positive for the parts of marijuana that are controlled, you could still discipline, fire them for it, or send them to rehab. You have to understand your state drug testing laws. So anyway, we have to understand each of these states. So, okay, let's talk about a primer on testing. So why should you test? So I guess this picture, I don't know why I put this picture in. Coffee, I guess, is his drug. But I love this Dilbert comic strip. I think it's super funny. So why test? I will tell you, every business is different. If you're, there's a number of reasons to test. We'll talk about a list of all of them on future slides. But I will say the way I look at drug tests is I look at it as a stupid test. Is the person stupid enough to fail this drug test, knowing that they're told that if they want this job as a new employee, that they've got to pass a drug test? I think the NFL Combine I think it's a litmus test for stupidity for aspiring football players. Everybody knows if you want to be an NFL football player that you're going to go to a combine, and you're like from the age of like 8 when you start playing football, that you're at the age of 21 or so, you are going to go to a combine. It's going to be the biggest job application of your life, worth potentially millions of dollars, and you're going to have to take a drug test. And if you fail, I think nobody should draft you because you're too stupid to either, one, not take some sort of marijuana or drugs within like 30 days to clean it out of your system, or two, somehow be able to get around that test. And so I think it's just a brainiac test, personally. Now there obviously are reasons, but that's for application. That's for applicants, and because they know, like in advance. How do you? Now it's different if it's post-accident, if it's a current employee. Obviously, we're going to want to look at some things. We've got a slide on that. But what should you consider? Well, you need to consider your business. You need to consider your recruiting population. Again, we'll look at slides on this. But there's a lot for you to consider. But this is the thought process. So strategically, when we're looking at setting up our HR program, we're looking at the risk, and we're doing risk analysis on this. We want to understand, like, what is the risk to our business? Is it going to prevent? Is it going to help prevent work comp claims? Is it going to help morale? Is it something that's going to affect our recruiting? With the NFL, I guess it impacts their recruiting because a few people every combine, somehow fail drug tests and probably deservingly don't get drafted. So how does that, and then we have to understand the legal landscape. Okay, so are we in California? Are we in Colorado? Are we in Maine? Are we in Illinois? Are we in these states that have legalized recreational marijuana? And if not recreational marijuana, what is the medical cannabis program in that state, or the CBD oil in that state? Now, CBD oil is never going to it should never test positive for THC, for a controlled substance. I don't know how many gallons or whatever of CBD oil. You'd probably die from CBD oil ingestion before you test positive for THC, or high enough anyway to register a positive test under the lab conditions. And of course, all CBD oil is a little bit different, and there's a lack of regulations on that. And sometimes, I know farmers might. I'm not saying I know this, but I'm sure there are some farmers out there that are trying to tweak their plants a little bit. But for the most part, your straight up legitimate CBD oil is not supposed to have, certainly no real THC to give you a high, and it's not supposed to give you enough unless you ingest like I say a lot to register a test and a positive test. And then we have to look at, when we're doing the drug testing, we're looking at our overall plan, we're going through this whole thought process, and we have to determine the elements, like what type of testing are we going to do? We're going to do employment testing, like application testing? Is it just going to be post-accident testing? I mean, if our real primary purpose is to lower safety accidents, like improve safety at the workplace and lower accidents, then why would we do application testing, right? We probably don't need to. Why would we do random testing? We might not need to. We might just want to do post-accident testing. So we want to understand our program, but this is a thought process, and then obviously we want to have a discussion on pros and cons. Okay, so why do employers test? Well, for required by law, it might be required by your government contract, but more likely than not, if you're required by law to do drug testing, it's because you've got over-the-road drivers. And, it's ubiquitous that everybody knows you've got, DOT testing. And I think for the most part, it's a good idea that people on our highways driving tractor trailers are not stoned. And I think it's just generally probably just a good idea that death machines driving up and down the highways at 70 miles an hour are not, ideally we do as much as we can to have people not be, unaware of their surrounding and that sort of thing. So anyway, we've got drug testing at the DOT level. That would be required by law. Required by contract. You might have a contract with, like either in construction or as part of a government contract, or a contract with another, with like a vendor or general contractor or whatever it is that requires you. So that might be a reason why you do it. Most employers, especially where there's more physical labor, whether it's like blue collar type, but most in a blue collar type of role, it's to reduce accidents. Work comp claims, if you haven't gotten the message, can be quite expensive. Most employers want to try to reduce their risk and try to get a handle on not just getting the, we've all got programs and have been, analyzing programs on returning employees to work, getting them off work comp so they stop sitting at home eating Cheetos and my favorite snack. And that's what I would do. If I had a work comp injury, I don't know how I'd get a work comp injury, being a lawyer, but I would sit at home. If I could do it, I would somehow sit at home and eat Cheetos. So I'm just going to assume everybody wants to eat Cheetos when they get a work comp. So you're just going to sit at home, collect benefits, collect wage loss benefits, and try to milk it for as much as possible. Obviously, we want to try to get, and employers are used to trying to get people back on their feet and back in the workplace. But we also, obviously, we want to do it from a safety standpoint. We want to reduce accidents because obviously it reduces our risk. It's probably, I guess, whatever. We try to not have employees get hurt too because we care about them. But more importantly, we care about our work comp exposure. And so we want to try to reduce the accidents. Some employers are ideologically driven and just don't like drugs in their workplace. That's okay too. A lot of people just, say no to drugs. And it's the Nancy Reagan. So a lot of employers are like that. That is entirely fine. It might not jive with the culture that you're trying to set. And really, under federal law, every employer should say no drugs in the workplace. So then also reduce mistakes on a performance. I've been told by people that have taken drugs that they're not at peak performance. I've interviewed them, and they have told me that they are not at peak performance when they are, high and stoned. And so making mistakes. So we generally don't want employees to be in a situation where they are making mistakes. Insurance costs. Some states even give you a benefit if you're doing drug testing. I think it's Oregon or Washington. It might be Washington. Says that if you have a drug testing program, that you'll get, maybe it's Florida. It might be, well, anyway, you get a break on your insurance, on your work comp insurance. So anyways, there can be some insurance costs, but probably the biggest cost is the lowering of risk, and hopefully lowering your premiums, your work comp exposure, and that sort of thing. And then public image. Some high-flying companies having a bunch of people smoking marijuana and talking about it, that might be a great thing for their image. For a lot of employers, it's probably not. There's clearly not as much stigma around this as there used to be. So society is definitely moving. U.S. politics and society and everything is definitely moving toward a more open, taking marijuana lifestyle, akin to like drinking alcohol. So it'd probably be there someday. Anyway, just like alcohol, that doesn't mean that you have to allow it in the workplace. So why don't employers test? Well, it's easy to just not test, right? It's one more thing for HR to do. A lot of states, I shouldn't say a lot, but a number of states have very comprehensive laws that you have to follow to a T if you are going to test employees. Minnesota and Iowa have probably the two most comprehensive testing statutes that if you don't follow them to a T, and I'm not just talking about like the lab, because the lab stuff, you go to a certified lab and their medical review of their MRO, they're taking care of that for the most part. But the notice, the testing, the rehab, all the costs with rehab, retests, all that, a number of states have that sort of protocol that it's a lot to do. It's a lot to know. And especially if you're a national company and you've got one or two locations in like Iowa or Minnesota, and you just think like, oh, I'm going to treat Minnesota employees just like I treat them in Texas, and that is absolutely not going to work. It would be just straight up, illegal under Minnesota and Iowa law, for example, if you didn't follow their laws, and you would, those employees could then sue you for reinstatement, and you don't want that because that's we want to try to avoid charges and lawsuits and stuff. So anyway, it's just easy to avoid. Of course, there's downsides with that, right? If you don't test, you might have increased work comp premiums, and you might have increased accidents and lower production and that sort of thing. It could be a recruiting problem. So a lot of employers don't want to recruit. It's kind of like doing the Social Security no match, the Social Security E-Verify. A lot of employers don't really want, your pool is to recruit from people that might have problems with E-Verify. It's kind of the same thing with application testing. It might lower the pool of who you're trying to bring into that job. So this is a tight labor market. I think a lot of employers are not testing, especially in states where it's legal, because, oh my gosh, like a lot of people are taking marijuana and recreationally, and they're testing positive, and I'm trying to get people in here to do the job. Even if I said, hey, if you test positive for marijuana, I'm not going to be able to hire you. Well, that might be a real problem in Colorado and California, especially if you're looking for more jobs that inure toward a younger workforce with millennials and that sort of thing. So it could be a recruiting problem. I will say, if I forget, what I've seen a lot of employers do is, especially in these states where where it's legal, a lot of employers have just said, yeah, we're going to drug test, but we're just not going to test for THC or cannabinoids or whatever it is that's part of that. So they're basically telling the labs, we're going to exempt THC from the testing, so don't even bother reporting on that. And that's kind of how if somebody's on meth or heroin or something, yeah, they're going to still come back, but you're not going to have somebody who's just taking marijuana recreationally. You're not going to care as much about that. So that's what a lot of, in the last few years, a lot of employers have started to just say, we don't really care as much about the marijuana side of it. We're just going to look at the heavier controlled substances. Not testing might not be impactful. There is a cost to testing. You might use rowing labs. If you're in an urban area, no big deal. There's a million testing labs probably in your area at the hospitals for collection. But if you're in a rural area, it might be more difficult, to send them to a local hospital where they probably do the testing. It can be disruptive. Not so much for application testing, but for current employees. I mean, somebody gets in an accident, boom, you got to stop work, send them. They're going to be gone for the rest of the day. You're sending them off to go get tested, probably off site. If it's a random test, you might lose that person for the whole day, but it's taking away from work at some level, and it's disruptive. Slows down the application process as well. But normally you can do the drug testing if you're doing a background check. You can normally do the drug testing while the background check is going forward. You can lose valued employees. Good employee, but hey, if you've got a policy and the person tests positive, you really don't want to make exceptions. You don't want to exempt that employee just because they're a good worker and just get rid of the people that are bad performers. That's kind of a problem we don't like. That's not HR best practice. We want to be uniform. If somebody violates a policy, you should be getting rid of them if that's how you've been handling situations under that policy. It's easy to be uniform. Competitive disadvantage, your competition might not be testing, and especially in the tight job market, it might be easier for them to recruit than for you, and that could be a real problem. More paperwork, morale. So anyway, that's why employers don't test. Considerations, these are the things to think about. What are you trying to achieve? Are you going to do voluntary or involuntary? What are the types of tests that you want to do? So this is all, when you're strategically thinking about your program, these are the questions that you want to ask yourself. You want to talk to your carrier, your broker. How is this going to, are we hoping to lower our work comp rates, our insurance rates? What's the cost savings there? Is the cost that we potentially could get on claims, is that going to outweigh the cost for doing the test itself and the time and the HR's involvement in this, and then the disruptions that it potentially has? So these are all the these are all the things that, all the questions that you need to ask yourself when you're thinking about it. And again, we need to understand the states. You know, what is the state? Is this just a medical cannabis state? Is this a state that does CBD oil? Is this a state that does all the above with recreational? And then what's the competition doing? So anyway, this is what we want to look at. We want to ask ourselves. Now, as far as the typical, the common types of testing, there might be other types of testing, but I think this is pretty much it. So you've got, and we've talked about it a little bit, and again, you have to understand your states. Every state's not going to allow for, most states don't have laws on drug testing, but for those states that do have laws, you have to understand if they restrict the type of testing that you can do. So we've got pre-employment or promotion testing, right? So new employees or employees who are getting new jobs, does that trigger? And again, we want to have a written policy on this if we're doing drug testing. Random testing. Normally, random testing is only used in safety-sensitive jobs. So we're not normally random testing accountants and lawyers. We're normally not, random testing office people. We are normally randomly testing safety-sensitive people. And then, of course, we have to figure out a random protocol. And you can outsource this to your drug testing vendors, where they might come in, they might, come on site, and they figure out that, give them an employee pool, and they do the randomizing and all that. But that's typically how it's done. Now, in some states, you're restricted to safety-sensitive random testing. But in other states, there's no law or anything, so you don't have to worry so much about it. So you could do random testing for everybody. You just have to ask yourself, do you really care about random testing accountants or, lawyers or something like that? Probably not worth it. It's probably not a pool that's really going to impact them. And if you're trying to lower work comp claims, it's pretty hard for lawyers to get a work comp claim just sitting at their desks or going to court. I'm sure it happens, but not as often as a packaging or a warehouse clerk probably has a work comp claim. And then you've got post-accident, and again, that's an issue to try to mitigate your damages in your work comp claim. So that's more of an aggressive approach with regard to your claim handling. And also because it also gives you a basis for getting rid of the employee if you find out that they were impaired during this. And it also gives you defense, and every state's different. I'm not trying to get everybody else super excited about this, but there could be, under state laws and cases, there could be the argument that if somebody is intoxicated, that they're outside the scope of their duties, and therefore you might not have to pay work comp, or you might be able to shift liability if there's like a property claim, or property or auto claim. Anyway, this is the sort of thing that we as lawyers look into, and so testing somebody might give you some added defense. And at a minimum, try to get rid of somebody who's proven that they get in accidents and are inebriated at the same time. Then there's rehab testing, and that's if the person has tested, you brought them back, and then they're going through rehab, and you test them for a period of time while they're on rehab. So that's rehab testing. And then routine physical testing, that's more often for your white collar workers, if you're doing like an annual physical for them, and you're just putting it in the you're having it as part of the physical. And then reasonable suspicion is normally if management, we normally don't want to go on like hearsay or secondhand reports, but normally we want reasonable suspicion to be if the supervisor or managers see the employee and they believe that the employee is intoxicated, and then under reasonable suspicion, they then say, okay, go and do a drug test. So that's reasonable suspicion. We don't want employees ratting each other out on this, but if a supervisor gets wind of it or sees it and then goes and witnesses it firsthand, that's normally what we're looking at for reasonable suspicion testing. Okay, so those are the types of testing that we typically look at for employees and applicants. And then here are just the states that have drug testing laws. So if you're in one of these states, then and you're doing drug testing and you're not familiar with the state law, I would recommend that you get familiar with the state law. Not all these states are going to have as many restrictions as like Iowa and Minnesota do, but you still need to be familiar with them because there are, flavors and nuances in a number of these states that might impact how you're testing and the type of notice that you're giving to employees and applicants, and just, the wording and general framework of your drug testing policy. So common themes among those states, and again, every state's different. You got to know your state. So call Thompson Co. Or call me or whatever, and we'll figure it out. Or call your lawyer if you're worried about somebody else or general counsel. But you need to understand those states before you're doing drug testing. Common themes. It needs to be in writing, and I've said this. I think I even have another slide in a few slides here that says as much. But it needs to be in. You need to have a policy. You need to have it in writing. It's just good practice, even if the state doesn't require it. The policy needs to be given, needs to be distributed to employees so that they understand what's going on, what they're being tested for, and they're given advance notice. Again, NFL Combine time with these prospective employees getting tested at the Combine, so that the NFL owners can see who's stupid enough to actually fail the test. The policy should explain circumstances for testing. So what's the basis? Reasonable suspicion, random, all the above, right? So which ones are we doing? You might not, care at all about random testing. You might be an accounting firm or an investment bank firm that's all white collar. You're not going to be doing post-accident testing. Nobody's driving a forklift and running into people there, right? Your paper cuts are what you're normally looking at. So you're probably not going to do that in a white collar environment. You might want to do just pre-employment applicant testing. So just put that in the policy. If you want to give yourself options, just put them all in your policy. But you need to articulate what the basis is for the testing. This is what should be in your policy. The limitations on the testing, you have to understand your states. Are there limits? Like I said, you need to understand Illinois law because Illinois law is coming online January 1 and Maine as well. And there are some restrictions on how you can test and treat people who test positive. So are there limitations? You should be using a certified lab to test. It should be federally certified lab to test. If you are doing your own collection, for example, in Iowa, every supervisor who is part of the drug testing process has to go through training every, I think, 2 years, maybe it's every year. But anyway, they have to go through training on this. And it's significant. Like, they have to go through significant training. That's a very unique thing to Iowa, so I don't want to get everybody all worked up about it because I don't think that's a requirement in any other state that I'm familiar with. But just most states, and even if you don't have a state law on this, use a certified lab to test. You should not be doing your own testing. You should have somebody else collect it. It should be third-party collector, whether it's and then sends it off to the lab to get tested. You want to demonstrate chain of custody. That's critical here because ultimately you are going to have examples where employees or applicants are questioning you, and they're asking if you're being discriminatory against them for whatever reason. Maybe because they think that you're only testing people in a protected class, like all men or all women or whatever, and you want to be able to prove that no, it's consistent policy. We're using this as professional. We're not just taking your blood and going and having fun with it. There's also genetic issues involved under GINA and state laws with regard to having blood and other genetic information. We want this all done by a third party with the results sent over to us to review. A lot of states allow for second chances. So if you do test positive, what are the second chances? In Minnesota, if you test positive, you have to be given the first time. You have to be given a second chance. Now, if you fail a second time, you're out the door. You can get kicked out the door. But it's required that you give the person an opportunity to go to rehab and come back. So you can't just go fire people in Minnesota that once they test positive. And Minnesota's not alone. There are other states that have that. So we have to understand if we're in a state that requires second chances because we talk about this being employment at will in this country. It's really not. There are so many laws at the state and local level, federal level too, but really the states and local municipalities are really getting into, there's just so much. I mean, every webinar we're doing every month, it's about at will, yes, but okay, let's be realistic. This is what these are the restrictions on how you can deal with your employees. And drug testing is just another one of them. And then a lot of states offer some sort of retest of the drug test, like a retest of a split sample, of a split specimen. Policy requirements, again, these are the things that you want to take a look at in your policy, things to consider. Depending on the state that you're in, you might not have to put all of these, and you might not want to put all of these, but if there's appeal procedures, you want to put that in your policy. This is your working guide for the types of elements that should be in a drug test. Now, I firmly believe that lawyers should be the one drafting your drug testing policies because I'm super biased on this issue. But, as a lawyer, but, here you go. These are the types of things. These are more the considerations, the key aspects, elements that you want to have in your policy, as well as from the other slides. And you're welcome. There he goes. So, and like I said before, here's my one slide. Good practice, have a drug testing policy. Firm believer in having drug testing policies if you're going to drug test. I just think that's how you should be doing it. Okay. So common protections, I've touched on some of these a little bit. So what are some of the employee protections? And again, say it again for like the millionth time, you got to know your state. You need to know your municipality. There are some ordinances out there with some cities. I think there are some cities and counties in New York, for example, or California. I know there are in California. I think maybe New York. Anyway, that have common protections for employees. So, for example, like I said before, every state that I'm familiar with, if there's a medical cannabis program, there is a protection that that if you're doing drug testing, that if the employee is a member of that medical cannabis program, that they are exempt from positive tests for at least like THC and controlled substance there. So can't really discriminate against them. And again, it doesn't. Every state that I'm familiar with, impairment, it doesn't allow them to be impaired. So that's still something you can push back on, but it's really hard to know what the definition of impairment means. I don't know what impairment means, and most states aren't defining it well, and we're just so new on this. There's not been a lot of case law in states that are really fleshing out what it means to be impaired. Most states have some sort of protection that you can't terminate or no adverse employment actions against employees because of their participation in a medical cannabis program. Again, participants in the medical cannabis, you would ignore the test results on that. And like I say, no state that legalizes recreational that prohibits employer testing. I mean, you can start from that there are no states out there. Now, again, Illinois and Maine put a lot of restrictions on it, and so we need to understand those. But for the most part, Colorado, the first state that had recreational marijuana legalized, I think, pretty sure it's Colorado, and then California was shortly thereafter. And they had a the law that even though it's just regarding Colorado, it set the tone for other states as well. And it was an employee who was very legally taking marijuana. And I think he was even taking it for medical reasons. I think there was a disability involved. But the employer, can't remember if it was application testing or random testing, but anyway, his employer, he tested positive, and he got fired or didn't get the job as a result. And Colorado courts, Colorado being very, legal, said, well, no, the employer is entirely able to have a drug testing program, and you failed. So I don't, just like same as if he had tested positive after drinking a bunch of Coors Light, coming into work drunk. Last substantive slide here. So when I say there's like medical conditions, like long-lasting pain, these are a lot of the medical conditions that are allowing employees or prospective employees to be part of the medical cannabis programs. So it's just kind of a list that I'm putting out there. But obviously every state's a little bit different on medical cannabis and how they get on the program. But just to give you an idea, these are a lot of the conditions that employees are having in order to get on that program. Okay. Good timing. We're a couple minutes short of 1 o'clock. Perfect. Thank you for your attention. I really appreciate this. We will be posting this on the myHRgenius.co website. You're welcome to call me directly with any questions, or another Thomas Co attorney, obviously, if you need help with any of this issue. Next month, it should be pretty awesome. They all are awesome, right? Webinar on texting, cell phones, harassment, and social media. So that's next month. We are seeing obviously a lot of hands-free laws around the country. What should employers be doing with just that issue alone? How does harassment work in the era of emojis and texting, and emails are a thing of the past. We're looking at IMs and we're looking at texts, and what do employers do when that stuff's happening at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning? So we're going to address a lot of this stuff next month. I appreciate your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and have a good month.